part of this new format will mean that everything we've just read, I'm not going to be able to cover all of it. Yeah, that's not going to happen. The idea is to get the main point behind this passage, why the writer has decided to put this bit of Exodus right at the beginning of chapter 1. And this evening is really going to be an introduction to Exodus, this series that we're going to start. I'm so excited for this series in Exodus. I love the book of Exodus because it points us so clearly, so wonderfully to the person of Jesus. And that is an amazing thing. And I hope as we go through, by the end of our series in Exodus, our minds are blown by this book that shows us Christ in amazing ways. So I can really encourage you as we start and right the way through these weeks to have the bit of the Bible we're looking at open in front of you. To have a Bible open. If you're watching at home, I'd encourage you to do the same. If you've got an app on your phone, do that too. But as I say, it's an introduction this evening. And as we embark on this incredible journey through Exodus, I want to introduce Exodus by framing it this evening. Giving it a frame so that we can look through it, giving us a context, laying a foundation that we can use as we go through this book together. A frame that the writer of Exodus wants us to look through as we start reading through this amazing book. Now, in order to get this frame, we actually have to look back before we look forward. We have to look back to Genesis before we start reading through Exodus, because the writer assumes that we have just finished reading the way through Genesis and flicked over the page, and here we are, ready to start Exodus chapter 1. Now, unless we are incredibly well prepared this evening, I highly doubt that we've just finished reading our way right the way through Genesis. But in order to get this frame for us that we need to understand Exodus, well, actually, Exodus says we need to understand Genesis, because without Genesis, Exodus is not going to make much sense to us. We're not going to get that frame that is going to help us as we look through. Okay, so you might be saying, so what do we need to know in Genesis that is going to help us to know as we look through Exodus? Well, as the profound wisdom of the Sound of Music says, let's start at the beginning, because it's a very good place to start. Absolutely, there we go. And at the start of Genesis, well, what do we see? At the beginning of it all, at the start of creation, who do we have? Well, we have God, and we have God's people, Adam and Eve. And where do we find Adam and Eve? Well, we find them in the Garden of Eden. We find them in God's place that he provided for them to be with him. And in the start of Genesis, we see this relationship that God had with his people. He walked with them in the garden. There was this amazing relationship that existed in the Garden of Eden. And what were Adam and Eve asked to do as God's people in God's place? Well, actually, they were asked and commanded to fill the earth and multiply. They were told to eat from all of the fruits of the trees that God had provided for them, apart from one, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So to recap, I've got some helpers for us. To recap, we have God's people, symbolized by our church weekend away photo, living in God's place, the globe, under God's rule. God is king, and with his blessing, symbolized by a bunch of grapes. Thank you. That's the recap. God's people in God's place under his rule, knowing his blessing. This is the world that God had made. It was good. It was perfect. It was life as it was meant to be. But then it all goes wrong. And as we read through Genesis, we get to the next chapter and it all goes wrong. And what do we find that goes wrong? Well, we find that God's people are banished from God's place. No more can they enter the garden that God had given to them. We see that actually instead of blessing, curse comes as they reject God's rule. And instead of multiplying, multiplying and increasing and filling the earth as God has commanded to them, what do we find instead? Cain and Abel, the two very first sons of Adam and Eve, well, actually, instead of increasing, it decreases. And there's murder as a result. It all goes horribly wrong. But although God's people have rejected God's rule and they've lost God's blessing and they're no longer in God's place, God brings a promise. God brings a promise. And in Genesis chapter 2, the promise is that from the offspring of Eve will come a serpent crusher. The devil had led humanity away, deceived them with lies about God's words. But God promises that one day through Eve, through the offspring of Eve, a serpent crusher is going to come. Someone who's going to restore everything that has just been lost. Someone who's going to come and restore everything that's just been broken as a result of humanity's sin. And so as we read on from Genesis, we wait generation by generation to wait and see who and where this promised one is going to come from. And in Genesis chapter 12, as we read on through Genesis, we get part of the answer to that question. And we see a man from Mesopotamia, modern day Iraq. But we see a man from Mesopotamia and his family are called by God, a man called Abraham. And in Genesis chapter 12, we get one of the most foundational promises that God gives. In fact, it's a promise that the rest of the Bible will almost rest upon. And in Genesis chapter 12, God says to this man from Mesopotamia, Abraham, he makes this promise to him. He says this, "The Lord has said to Abraham, go from your country, your people, and your father's households to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." But later on in Genesis 12, it says, "To your offspring I will give this land." Now, it's a great promise, isn't it? But did you notice what God was promising? Do you notice the themes in that promise that God was promising? He's going to make Abraham and his family a great nation. He's going to make them his people. And he's going to increase their numbers. In the next chapter, God would say that Abraham's descendants will be like the stars in the sky. You cannot number them. And he's going to take them to a land so that they can be in God's place. God's people in God's place and under, God says, under his rule. And he's going to bring his blessing on his people too. Can you see how everything that was lost, God promises to Abraham he's going to restore to his family? And actually, not just his family that's going to be blessed, but God says all families across the world are going to be blessed through his family. Do we see that, how this isn't just a random promise that God is giving to Abraham? This is everything that has been lost since the beginning of the Garden of Eden and with Adam and Eve. People, place, rule, and blessing. And that promise of the serpent crusher? What's happened to that? Well, actually, that's how this family is going to bless all peoples. Because we find that this serpent crusher, this promised one, is going to come through Abraham's family. It's going to come through his offspring. And when we go through the rest of Genesis, it's this promise that is repeated over and over and over again. It's repeated to Abraham. It's repeated to Abraham's son Isaac in Genesis chapter 24, verses 3 and 4. It says, "Stay in this land for a while. I will be with you," God says, "and I will bless you. For to you and your descendants I will give all these lands and will confirm the oath I swore to your father Abraham. I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and will give them all these lands, and through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed." It's the same promise. It's repeating the next generation. And not just to Abraham's son Isaac, but to Isaac's son Jacob, we find. And the same promise God says to Jacob in Genesis chapter 26. This theme of people, place, rule, and blessing. It's amazing. This is the frame, if you can put it, that Genesis is building for us to look through. God promises people to make them a great nation. Promises large numbers of people like the stars in the sky. God promises their own land. God promises being under his rule and knowing his blessing. And through his people, Israel, the promised rescuer and restorer of all things, everything that has been broken as a result of humanity's sin, is going to come through that people to bless all peoples. Now, at this point, I want to pause, and we're going to pause halfway through, and we'll gather around our tables. And having this frame for us to look through, that Genesis is building for us and laying the foundation for, looking at Exodus chapter 1, our passage tonight, what's the problem when we see and we read through Exodus chapter 1, knowing everything that Genesis has been building for us? What's the problem when we get to Exodus chapter 1? What should we expect to see in Exodus 1? And what's the reality? That's the first question. And then secondly, I want you to imagine that you're an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham, living in Egypt, living in Exodus chapter 1. And I want you to talk about what questions would you have if you were living at that time, knowing everything that God had promised in Genesis. So 2 questions. Why don't we gather around our tables for a couple of minutes, and then we'll go into the second half. 2 questions. There we go. They're on the screen. And at home, if you want to just reflect, maybe you're with a couple of people, ask one another. If not, reflect yourself as we spend this time around our tables here at the building at 181. Let's gather around our tables. Give us 30 more seconds. Right, well, I know it's maybe not enough time, but we'll come back from our time of discussion. And maybe, firstly, knowing the frame provided for us in Genesis, that Genesis has been building for us, people, place, rule, blessing. What's the problem when we read through Exodus chapter 1? What do we think? I'm going to try something. Here we go. Would anyone be willing to say what a problem is? In the wrong place. Yeah. Under Pharaoh's rule. Absolutely. Yeah. Fantastic. Absolutely. You see, when we start reading through Exodus, things immediately jump out to us. As we've said, God's people are firstly not living in God's land. They're in Egypt. They're in a foreign land, not a land that God had promised, the land of Canaan. And therefore, they're not under God's total rule. They're subjected under Pharaoh's rule. And actually, with Pharaoh's rule doesn't come blessing, it actually comes curse. They're made to work ruthlessly. They're oppressed. They're enslaved. And most of all, as Pharaoh embarks on this genocidal rampage, as you read through Exodus chapter 1, where he orders that newborn boys are thrown into the Nile, well, actually, the promise of God's people being as numerous as the stars of the sky, well, that promise is under threat. And actually, not just that promise, but remember the promise of the restorer, the rescuer. That promise is under threat. Because we saw that the rescuer, the serpent crusher, is going to come through Abraham's offspring. And as Pharaoh's trying to kill off all of these newborn babies, we see that promise is under threat. As we read through Exodus chapter 1, everything that God promised in Genesis seems like is under threat. So imagining you're an Israelite in Egypt, what questions might be going around your mind at this point? What questions might you be coming to your mind as you're sitting down for dinner after a day's slave labor under the Egyptian hot sun? What questions might you be talking with one another about? Maybe does anyone have any? What do people think about the second question? What questions might you have? Where is God? Absolutely. Absolutely. You'd be asking all of these questions. No doubt questions begin to arise. Is God really faithful to his promises? Because what God promised and what life actually looks like are two very different things for an Israelite living in Egypt to this point. Is God going to do anything? Does God know what's happening? Is God powerful enough? Maybe. Questions begin to arrive. Pharaoh looks so strong. Egypt looks unconquerable, unshakable. And yet, with all of those questions that maybe would be going through an Israelite's mind living in Egypt, as we read through the first chapter of Exodus, did you notice something about every time that God's promises are threatened, what actually the writer of Exodus records? Do you see hints of what God is wanting to point us to, even whilst that's all under threat, it seems? Because whilst God's promises are under threat, God behind the scenes, an undercurrent of his faithfulness is being shown to his people. Do you see that in verse 7? In verse 7 of chapter 1. But the Israelites were exceedingly fruitful. They multiplied greatly, increased in numbers, and became so numerous that the land was filled with them. Verse 11 of chapter 1. So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor. And they built Pithom and Ramesses as store cities for Pharaoh. The promise is under threat, but, do you see verse 11? The more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. Verse 20 of chapter 1. So God was kind to the midwives, and the people increased and became even more numerous. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own. Again, that last one in verse 20 with the midwives, pointing us again back to Genesis chapter 12, when God says, whoever blesses you, I'm going to bless. Whoever curses you, I'm going to curse. It's a fulfillment of that promise. We see God's faithfulness as we read through Exodus chapter 1, even when all of that seems like it's under threat. God still proves faithful. God still stands above it all. When God seems absent, actually Exodus chapter 1 shows us he's present. When we wonder what God is doing, Exodus 1 shows us God is working. And when his people need a rescue, God provides an exodus. As we see God's faithfulness to his promise to Abraham, that his descendants will outnumber the stars, we remember that God will be faithful to all of his promises. God is speaking to his people in this moment. He will be faithful to every single promise he has made to them. And that's really what we see right the way through Exodus. God's faithfulness to his promises. It's what we see right the way through the Bible. And actually, when we get to Matthew's gospel, well, we're introduced to another king, another ruler, King Herod. And what do we see when we see King Herod? We see a king ruling over God's oppressed people with the authority of a foreign superpower that seems unshakable. We see a king threatening newborn children, don't we? Ordering a genocidal rampage across Israel and Judea of every boy under 2. Sounds familiar, right? And the question again comes, will God be faithful? Will his promises fail? And yet what do we see when we see the same story? Despite the king's plans, a child is born. One who will rescue his people, not from slavery to Rome, but from their slavery to sin. The one who had waited thousands and thousands of years to see, the serpent crusher, finally arrived, who would rescue not just his people, but all peoples, not through the enemy's firstborn son being struck down, but through him, God's only son, being struck dead, so that the captives could be set free. Sounds a lot like the Exodus story, right? And we've got so much to see as we go through Exodus, as it points us to the Lord Jesus. But today and this evening, I really want to end with this. I wonder, do you feel sometimes like people in Exodus chapter 1? Not so much feeling oppressed or so much enslaved by a foreign superpower, but maybe in our current circumstances and surroundings, we doubt maybe God's faithfulness to us. We doubt God's promises because they seem like they are under threat from every conceivable angle. Young people, do you know, I imagine that as soon as we leave here, it seems like everything is pointing away from the fact that God is faithful to his promises. It seems like all of God's promises are under threat. You see how the world is changing, and it's moving, it seems, in completely the other direction. You hear the things that are expected, the pressures and the problems that you and our world face. You see the reputation that the church has on social media and on the news from your friends and maybe even your family. And you wonder, God's promises seem so far from the reality that you experience each day. It all feels threatened by our circumstances. It all feels like when you walk into school, when you walk into the office, when you go maybe home, that everything is pointing in the other direction. Life maybe feels like it's getting harder, not easier. And you wonder if you can really be confident in God and the promises that he makes to you. You wonder whether maybe God is even powerful enough to overcome what seems such massive opposition. Well, know from Exodus chapter 1 that you're not too far removed from how people in Exodus 1 were feeling. To them, everything pointed in a different direction. Egypt looked unshakable. Slavery seemed inevitable for a lifetime. And yet Exodus shows us that we can be thoroughly confident in our God to fulfill absolutely all of his promises to us. In chapter 1, we get just a glimpse of that, a glimpse of his faithfulness. And the rest of the Exodus will show his faithfulness in ways that we couldn't comprehend. And you know, when we think about today, of all days, Easter Sunday, don't you think people on Easter Saturday, when they put Jesus' body in the grave, were asking the same questions? Everything's pointing the wrong way. Is God going to be faithful? Doesn't look like he will. Death looks inevitable for Jesus. And yet today we celebrate the most amazing news that Christ was raised from death to life. God was faithful when it looked like he wasn't. And death was not the end. So our lesson from Exodus 1, when everything seems like God's promises are being threatened, God will always be faithful. That's true 5,000 years ago in Egypt. That's true 2,000 years ago in Jerusalem. And that will be true tomorrow in Caterham. God will be faithful always. No matter what the reality, no matter what the circumstances, no matter what surrounds us, no matter what it seems are threatening God's promises, God will be faithful. What a glorious promise for us to cherish as we head into this week.